Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, around the city, across the state, coming to you live from the heart of Chicago. It's e-learning with Mr. Moeller. So today what we're going to talk about is the colonization of North America. It's going to be a very, very brief, very incomplete history, but it's going to get us where we need to go as far as class. So just to kind of point out real quickly, not everything is going to make it into this video. A couple of kind of really important trends that aren't going to be in here. One is going to be slavery. Slavery is going to be an integral part of the plantation economy. It's going to be a big part of the United States from day one. We're going to get into slavery a little bit later in the year and do a real deep dive. And then secondly, we're not going to talk an awful lot about kind of the Native American wars and how that's going to go. Again, topics that will be covered at other times. But just to kind of set the stage here, as we know, the Americas before 1492 are a populated place with populations, civilizations, all sorts of things. And so our story, though, when we talk about the United States of America, starts with European colonization in the Americas. But at the time of European colonization, I always like to point out that in Cahokia, Illinois, Cahokia Mountain still there was a massive city, bigger than London was at the time. And so kind of the world is a very different place, but once kind of contact between Europe and the Americas happens, that's going to redefine everything about the history of this continent. And you dug into that last year, and you'll dig into that in your other history class as well. So we kind of pick up the story with the Age of Sail and European colonization. The Christopher Columbuses, Portugal, Spain, kind of, traveling the world and setting up these colonies. And so what this ends up doing for the United States is that it kind of kicks off this idea that there will be future colonies in what is now considered the United States. So after the Columbian Exchange, huge consequences, right? Diseases, war, but also a lot of kind of back and forth of goods, back and forth of crops, things like that. And so Columbian Exchange really does change everything about the world that we're talking about. And it also changes everything for the American Indians that are living inside of what is now the United States. Diseases are going to hollow out their population base. All of a sudden, new economic systems, trading kind of fur and other things, is going to replace that kind of self-sufficient economy that kind of we associate with a lot of American Indian tribes. But there's also going to be kind of a series of wars, a series of removals. But despite this backdrop, the Native Americans, they're very politically important, especially at first, especially kind of before the American Revolution, because they represent a large piece of the population that's well organized, that's been living there. And so while later there's going to be a complete removal, there is a lot more in the early days of kind of the American colonization, a lot more overlap of these systems. But as we can see kind of very quickly in the era of the colonization of the Americas, European powers are going to kind of gobble up and claim huge chunks of North and South America. And what will become the United States at this point is partially claimed by Britain, France, as well as Spain at the exact same time. And so we're going to have to look at that as well and how kind of these colonies became countries later on. But when we talk about exploration, we almost never talk about Great Britain, right? We talk about Spain and Portugal and all those different people because really Great Britain's government, the monarchs at the time, they were not really interested in the New World, in colonization exploration. Henry Hudson kind of explored North America, found the Hudson River, all that stuff, but no one really followed up. There's no kind of permanent colonies that were set up after Henry Hudson. And so by 1607, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands were all way ahead of Great Britain as far as doing this colonization thing. But people in Britain saw the New World and saw the potential wealth, the opportunities that kind of some of these other countries were getting. And so they actually began to look at colonization not as a political thing. We're going to take over this territory, it's going to make us powerful, but as an economic thing, entrepreneurship. That we could set up a colony as a business and make an awful lot of money out of it. And so that's kind of a change in attitude that's going to mean the American colonies are going to be very different. The British American colonies are going to be very different than the others. And so when we're asking our question, kind of why did Britain colonize North America, let's first look at it through the lens of economics. First and foremost, it's an investment opportunity. Land is available. There are tales of gold and riches in the New World. And so wealthy Britain got together and they said, this is a great investment opportunity. It's a great way for us to make some money. And so they formed what were known as joint stock companies, like modern corporations that have shareholders owning stock. And this allows multiple people to own a business together. Well, now that you can put together a bunch of people's money, you don't need a king or one super, super wealthy individual to fund this. And so the British American colonies are actually going to be created without the government. They're created solely pretty much for the purpose of creating money. And other factors that are going to influence this, there is recession and poverty in England at this time. The economy is changing. And so you have colonists who are willing to leave England to seek new opportunities. And then lastly, both kind of private businesses and the government at this time knew that if you had a colony, that colony would sell you things. And since you controlled that colony, they would buy your manufactured goods. And so the system is called mercantilism. But all is that to say is that when Britain is founding colonies, they're really founding them for the purpose of trying to make money, getting into this mercantilism type of a system. And so a huge invention, I guess, in economic life invention in the way that we buy and sell, in this case, the way we buy and sell companies, was a joint stock company, allowing multiple people to put their money together and own a business. And so Virginia was actually founded not by the King of England, but by the Virginia Company, a private joint stock company that created this colony in order to make money. And so a lot of colonies were set up that way. The very first colony in the Americas, permanent colony Virginia, was set up for that purpose. Eventually John Rolfe, shown there in the picture, he cultivates tobacco in a real serious way, and they're off to the races. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, a lot of the southern colonies were actually set up solely as either places for people to make money or a place to send impoverished workers. And so it's a big, big piece of this. So moving away from the economics here, what about politics? What about power and government? And so one of the really big things that's going to push Britain into North America is rivalries with other European powers. To fall behind is to lose. And so in order to compete, basically they thought that they had to colonize. More territory always equals more power. And then also government-wise, you can solve a lot of problems with the colony. You can send criminals to the colony to work. You can send debtors, people who owe money. Instead of sending them to prison, you could send them to the colonies to work off their debt. And also, they were a great place to get rid of people who were causing you trouble. The Puritans were causing a lot of trouble in Great Britain, and so they formed a colony in Massachusetts Bay, and basically the government was like, just get out of here. So there's a lot of good reasons to colonize, and so Britain, once it starts with those joint stock companies, is going to jump on it and encourage it. Then lastly, what does culture have to do with this? What does sociology have to do with all of this? And so we'll start with just religion. In this time, there's a Protestant Reformation, and England forms its own church called the Church of England. Well, this creates rivalries between Catholic nations like a France or a Spain and England, which is now has the Church of England, it's Protestant. And so that rivalry alone is enough to encourage a lot of people to go and settle the New World for the right God. Reformers who want to fix societal ills and criminality saw the colonies as a wonderful opportunity to reform people and have them, start over. And then finally, there's always this sense of wanting to spread your civilization into a new place. And so the spreading of British civilization to the New World became a core component of early colonization. And so again, we have Martin Luther creates the Protestant Reformation. Then we have the Church of England in 1534. If you know Henry VIII and the story with his wives, he wanted a divorce. Catholic Church wouldn't allow it. And so he broke away to form the Church of England. Well, the problem with forming an official state religion is anyone who is not that religion, like Catholics, like Puritans, or any other groups, they're going to maybe want to leave because now they feel like they're being persecuted by the government, and that's a great reason for them to pack up their stuff, leave England, and go somewhere where they can be religiously free, right? And so a lot of these groups got their start this way. Catholics, Quakers, Puritans, a lot of colonies were founded for this express purpose. Maryland was founded solely for Catholic, Mary Land, right? Plymouth Bay was founded by Pilgrims, Pennsylvania by the Quakers, Massachusetts Day, oh, that should read Bay, that's a typo by Mr. Moeller. Puritans, right? And then Rhode Island even was a break-off of people who thought the Puritans were too religiously oppressive. And so a lot of these colonies were really founded for that idea of cultural freedom. I love the kind of story of Rhode Island. You should look it up. But these two people, and Hutchinson and Roger Williams, they got into a bit of a fight with the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay and their religious laws. Roger Williams said forced religion stinks in the nostrils of God, and they were both banished. And so what they did is they simply packed up their followers, they moved miles down the road, and they formed the colony of Rhode Island. And so again, this is a kind of a weird time where there's a lot of opportunity to really start new things. And a lot of these people take advantage. William Penn and the Quakers, again, Penn's Woods, Pennsylvania is meant to be the homeland for the Quakers. And if you feel like you know this guy, it's because you do. William Penn is the Quaker Oats man. Yes, oh yes indeed. So you've been looking at Quaker Oats. That's the founder of the state of Pennsylvania, William Penn, going there to seek religious and political freedoms. So if we want to kind of just wrap up this piece of the video real quick, why form colonies of Great Britain? Well, for glory, for the betterment of Great Britain, for power, for prestige, for God, for all those religious reasons that we talked about, Catholic rivalries, with Protestants, as well as gold. And that is pretty much the major one. If you're looking at Great Britain, the main reason that they're founding colonies is for economics. It's for the purposes of making money and trade in another part of the world. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and kind of look at the colonies' place in the world. So these American colonies are actually founded all separately. They don't coordinate, they don't have a government, they're not ruled by the same person in England. And so because of that, they're really going to grow very independent. Geographically, autonomy for these colonies is huge. They're across the ocean from technically the government that owns them. These colonies are actually spread out pretty far. We think about how big the United States is. You don't have a car, you have a horse, or you're walking if you can't afford a horse. And so geography means they're pretty spread out. They get to be on their own. That's what autonomy means. And so, of course, this causes conflicts when you want to make decisions and someone else wants to make decisions for you. And so they had arguments over trade. Who gets to control the trade? Can the colonies trade with whoever they want, or does Britain control them? Who should tax them? Which government, is able to collect their money? They fought over political control. Which government gets to make the laws? The colonial government or the British government, right? Culture shifts, geography and immigration are going to have a huge piece of this. People from all over come into the Americas, and so these colonies by 1750, they're not really British anymore. A large contingent of the people living in the British colonies are actually no longer British. They're from other parts of Europe, they're from other parts of the world, and that's going to be a big change. And so the first big thing is economics. If the colonies want to make as much money as they can for themselves. If you're a business person, that's what you want to do. But Great Britain saw them as just kind of something to be controlled and used to make Great Britain wealthy, not to make the individual colonial business owners wealthy. And that's what mercantilism is, that the colonies ship over to Great Britain all their raw materials, and then in the colonies, you are only allowed to buy British goods. So the idea of that is a closed system. But as you guys saw in the economics flip lecture, right, competition is really what makes things happen, not, control. And so Britain had a series of fights with the colonies over navigation acts. These were laws that restricted trades, that said that everything had to be Britain. They had to use British ships, British crews. They could only trade with Great Britain. They could not trade with the Dutch or the French or the Spanish. And so if you're a colonial business person, you want to make as much money as possible, this is going to be upsetting to you, even if Britain technically owns you. And so what this led to, leading up to the American Revolution, was a lot of fights. Fights over taxes. This is the place to affix the stamp. The stamp tax was a major tax on printed goods and traded goods that the colonists revolted against. These guys are smuggling because simply just smuggling became widespread in the colonies. John Hancock, very famous guy, right? He got his start as the most successful smuggler in Boston, Massachusetts. And so these fights kept kind of boiling over until finally you have the American Revolution. And a big part of it is going to be over control of trade. Another big problem is the question of who should rule the colonies. For over 100 years, from 1607 to the 1740s, every colony had a different government. 13 different governments, 13 different colonies, and the British government didn't really care. Some of these colonies were run by companies, like joint stock companies. Others were run by democratic assemblies. Others were run by one person who owned it. Others were run by a military governor sent over from Great Britain. In Massachusetts Bay, it was theocracy, it was run by the religious leaders. And so there's all these weird different types of government, and Britain is really content at this time to not get involved. They're making money, people are going there. Really, it doesn't make any sense for them to get involved yet. But by the 1740s, Britain had begun to put their hands a lot more into the politics of the colonies. And so by 1740, most of the colonies have some type of assembly. And there's some kind of more of a sense of equality, more people are involved in government, more people want to vote. And so that's going to be a big thing in the Americas. Freedom of religion is available in every colony by 1740. And so ultimately, by this time, by the time of the run-up to the American Revolution, all the colonies had kind of had some similar things happen. And so all these things eventually become American government. The Mayflower Compact in Massachusetts was the first social contract. The first representative government in the Americas was the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Pennsylvania pioneered individual liberty. Rhode Island was the first to do separation of church from state. Connecticut was the first colony to write a constitution to govern it. And so all these ideas that will become the United States, they're available here, they're not available, they're in these colonies leading up to it. And then kind of finally, there's a huge culture shift that's going to happen. And a good way to talk about this is this quote, "A new nationality requires a new nation." So in order to get as many people as possible in these British colonies, they opened them up to everyone. If you were German, Dutch, Spanish, if you were a native, anyone really could come into these colonies. There was no restrictions. So what that meant is they're very diverse. It means they're less British. They're more diverse, kind of the way America is today, right? We are not just one ethnicity. We're a lot of very much different ethnicities all over the place. And a lot of them had actually left Britain for a number of reasons. And so what kind of emerges is this lack of loyalty to Britain, this kind of sense of being American, that we're not loyal to Britain, we are loyal to ourselves. And that's going to be big when you talk about the decision for the United States to risk independence. A big piece of it is cultural. And so to kind of summarize, the colonies were founded as investments. They were founded for religion, and they were founded to expand the power of Great Britain in the world. And they were set up to provide new markets, to be a source of raw materials, and to expand political power abroad. The colonists who came valued economic opportunities and individual liberties. And the colonies for a long time enjoyed great wealth and great political freedoms and self-rule. In a lot of ways, the Americans at this time are some of the freest people in the entire world. But, of course, the world changes all the time. And so if you're living in the American colonies, you're also living under the threat of global politics. If Britain and France go to war, or Britain and Spain, or Britain and anyone go to war, all of a sudden, your colonies are at war. All of a sudden, war might come to the Americas. The colonies also, too, wanted to expand west, and Britain didn't want them to. Britain had a really great relationship with a lot of kind of the native tribes and their governments and confederations, military alliances, and the colonies were actually screwing this up. And so Britain was trying to stop the colonists from pushing onto Indian lands, which caused a lot of problems. Trade was a big problem. Smuggling and trading with Britain's enemies, even during wartime, to the American colonists, it was like, hey, money is money. But to Britain, it was a betrayal. And then finally, who really had the authority to decide these issues? Who was going to decide what was actually going to happen in the colonies? And in 1740, it was hard to tell, and nobody was sure. But that would all get cleared up real fast with the 7 Years' War that would eventually lead into the American Revolution. So in a lot of ways, historians argue the war that made America wasn't the Revolution, it was the 7 Years' War. And so the context of the 7 Years' War is that really it's considered the first big world war. It's fought all over the world between these European colonial powers. It's fought in the Americas. It is fought in India. It is fought in Europe. And so in 1754, the world is at war. Almost every major country that has international presence is fighting. And so in a war to expand empires, in a war to seize colonies, of course, one of the main battlegrounds is going to be the Americas, where all these countries have staked a claim. And so the 7 Years' War is going to spill over into all over the world, and it's going to pit some pretty big alliances. Great Britain, actually this time, ironically, is going to be allied with the Iroquois Confederacy, a native confederacy who then the colonists will eventually fight in a couple of wars when they become the United States. And so kind of the world really splits into two camps and they fight each other. And so the war is happening around the world, but then the war is going to come to the Americas. And when the war comes to the Americas, well, Great Britain has to defend it, but Great Britain is fighting all over the world. And so what they ask is for their colonists to take up arms and fight on behalf of the British Empire. And they put in charge of Virginia, the largest colony, their militia, their citizen soldiers, a very young man in his early 20s named George Washington. And George Washington in this war becomes a hero. He's the leader of the largest colonial militia. He fights a battle at Fort Necessity, which you can see there, and loses. Then he fights at Fort Duquesne and wins. And essentially, if you're thinking about, well, who's George Washington? He becomes a national legend by fighting in this piece of the war. The French and Indian War is what we called it inside the Americas. And so it launches his career. And all these battles are going to take place kind of in and around the border between New France and then, the British American colonies. So one big thing that emerges during this war, we're not going to get all the details of the battles or anything, was that the colonies had a lot of trouble fighting it. They never had worked together before. You had 13 different militias, each doing stuff. Some colonies didn't want to fight at all. Others sent way too many people. And so they had never worked together or shared a government. And this was problematic. And so one man in Pennsylvania called Benjamin Franklin decided, hey, why don't we try to get all the colonies together and then we can fight a war together and surely we'll be able to win. And so he proposed the Albany Plan of Union, and he created this image, very famous image, widely also considered the first political cartoon in what would become the United States. And his message was simple: either the colonies join together and fight, or they will not be successful in this war. The colonial governments rejected this plan. They didn't want to work together. They did not trust each other because they had never done it before. But when the 1770s roll around and there's a national crisis, a lot of the same leaders who were pushing for the Albany Plan of Union will then push for the colonies to come together as the United States of America. But ultimately, this war is fought. It's a fun war. It's a great war. We don't have time to go into all the details. But England wins, and the American colonies win. They defeat France, and they take a bunch of territory. But unfortunately, this smashing victory that should have been a cause for celebration was actually the moment that split the American colonies from Great Britain. Wars are always huge changes, and chaos is a ladder. And the colonies, in the victory, believed that they would be even more autonomous, and they had earned their place as an equal member in the British Empire. Great Britain saw this as a great opportunity to bring in those troublesome 13 children back into the family. And so the disagreement over how to move into the future after the French and Indian War is going to be the main source of conflict that will cause the American Revolution. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.